For years, her hatred of Jim Morrison was dismissed as jealousy, bitterness, or plain resentment. People assumed she just couldn't stand the myth, the fame, or the chaos that followed him everywhere. But that explanation never really fit. This wasn't a casual dislike. It was deep, personal, and unwavering. Now, with the full picture finally coming into focus, her anger makes sense. Because what she saw in Jim Morrison wasn't a misunderstood genius or a tortured poet. It was something far darker. And once you understand what she knew, it becomes impossible to see him the same way again. Jim Morrison, the legend. Jim Morrison was an enigma. And decades after his death, he's still treated like a force rather than a person. One of the most influential figures in rock and roll history, he didn't just make music, he bent culture around him. His songs carried the same energy he did, restless, confrontational, impossible to ignore. And they went on to shape musicians, artists, and poets well beyond his own era. He moved through the world like a rebel with no interest in fitting in, a nonconformist who seemed to understand that disruption was part of the job. Morrison believed that creation required destruction first, and he lived that idea fully, recklessly, right up to the point where it caught up with him. The wildness was real, but it wasn't the whole story. Early on, before the chaos swallowed the narrative, Morrison was painfully shy. During the first performances by The Doors, he sometimes sang with his back to the audience, as if hiding from the very spotlight that would later define him. Around that same time, before acting ever entered the picture, Harrison Ford worked quietly behind the scenes as a stagehand and second camera assistant for the band, brushing past history before anyone realized what it would become. By 1966, even before the band signed with Elektra Records, Morrison was already thinking in myth-sized terms. He told his bandmates that one day he would fake his own death just to amplify their notoriety. 5 years later, when he actually died, the effect was exactly what he'd predicted. Album sales exploded, the legend hardened, and the story grew larger than the man. That same refusal to play along showed up on live television. When The Doors were booked on The Ed Sullivan Show, the network asked Morrison to change the lyrics to "Light My Fire" to avoid drug references. He agreed. Then, under the studio lights, he ignored the deal and sang the original words anyway. Ed Sullivan was reportedly furious, refused to shake their hands, and the band was never invited back. Morrison had made his point, and he didn't bother apologizing. Even in death, he couldn't be contained. Fans flocked in such numbers to his grave at Père Lachaise Cemetery that local residents once formally requested the site be removed altogether. The request was denied. Today, Morrison's grave is the second most visited spot in Paris, trailing only the Eiffel Tower, a quiet reminder that the obsession never really faded. For all his reputation as a reckless rock god, Morrison had his softer contradictions. His favorite singer of all time was Frank Sinatra, and when The Doors recorded Strange Days, Morrison insisted on using the same type of microphone Sinatra favored in the studio. Even icons have their heroes, and he never tried to hide his. Many adults at the time saw him as a bad influence, a walking warning sign for their children. What they missed was the intellect behind the chaos. Morrison had an IQ of 149 and a deep hunger for poetry, consuming the romantic visions of William Blake alongside the beat voices of Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, while quietly writing poems of his own. His family hoped he'd take a very different path, one modeled after his father's career in the U.S. Navy. Morrison resisted that future entirely. He attended University of California, Los Angeles, more out of avoidance than ambition, once admitting that he didn't want the Army, didn't want a job, and wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. When Morrison died in 1971, the shock rippled across the world. He became part of the infamous 27 Club, joining Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. After Joplin and Hendrix passed, Morrison reportedly told friends at a bar that they were drinking with number 3. It sounded like a dark joke at the time. It didn't age that way, and once you sit with all of this, the legend starts to feel less glamorous and more unsettling. The mystery doesn't disappear. If anything, it deepens. Artists who despise Jim Morrison. While the Doors are now carved into music history, that ending was never a sure thing. If their peers had been the ones writing the story, the band might have slipped through the cracks. To many musicians inside the scene, they felt like the loudest symbol of everything that had gone too far. The drugs, the excess, the hazy Los Angeles hippie culture stretched until it stopped feeling free and started feeling hollow. At the center of it all stood Jim Morrison, a man who didn't just perform like a chosen figure, but seemed to believe he was one. He treated the scene like a stage built just for him, convinced he was its meaning and its message. Fans leaned into that myth without hesitation. Other musicians didn't. To them, Morrison wasn't deep or dangerous in an interesting way. He was a familiar act dressed up as revelation. Inside the band, the image was reinforced. Keyboardist Ray Manzarek once described Morrison as the embodiment of hippie counterculture rebellion. As the Lizard King, he became the face of a decade obsessed with freedom and excess. Music, poetry, sex, ego, and spirituality blurred into one wild package. More than almost any other act, the Doors captured the seedy, seductive pulse of the era. Fronted by a man women wanted to be with and men wanted to be. But admiration from fans didn't translate into respect from fellow artists. Morrison's lyrics and unpredictable performances earned attention, yet his personality did something else entirely. He built enemies quickly, and that list only grew longer with time. The 1960s talked endlessly about peace and love, but Morrison's behavior kept pushing people away. His drug-fueled lifestyle often slipped into cruelty, disrespect, and moments that made other musicians wonder if he cared about the craft at all. Some of the tension came down to taste. A lot of it came down to Morrison himself. Stories followed him everywhere. Violence, abuse, mistreatment of women, a complete disregard for how seriously others took their work. That kind of energy didn't create friendships. It created distance. And more than a few artists made it clear they wanted nothing to do with him. On one side of the country, a sharp-tongued figure at the center of New York's art underground watched the Los Angeles scene with open contempt. While Morrison soaked up the sun in Laurel Canyon, this artist stood shoulder to shoulder with Andy Warhol, shaping a colder, darker movement that valued irony over excess. To him, hippie culture wasn't profound, it was empty. For a while, the two coasts sat in a cultural standoff. New York seeing LA as shallow, LA seeing New York as bleak and joyless. Things turned personal when that East Coast circle became convinced Morrison had taken more than inspiration. After watching the Velvet Underground perform in Warhol's exploding plastic Inevitable alongside dancer Gerard Malanga, Morrison began leaning into a similar leather-heavy image. Warhol later recalled Malanga erupting with anger, convinced his look had been stolen. Morrison's chaotic affair with Nico only deepened the resentment. When Morrison died, the reaction from that camp wasn't grief. It was cold amusement, sharp and unsparing. Elsewhere, resentment didn't simmer. It exploded. In 1968, during one of the scene's infamous jam sessions, Morrison ended up in the same room as Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. What should have become legend collapsed into chaos. Morrison crossed lines, becoming abusive and aggressively inappropriate on stage. Joplin reportedly smashed a bottle over his head. Witnesses later described Hendrix as gentle and reserved, the complete opposite of Morrison's confrontational presence. Even before that night turned ugly, respect was already missing. As Morrison staggered through a drunken attempt at singing, producing something closer to noise than music, Hendrix reportedly turned it into a cutting joke, announcing to the crowd that they had just heard the sound of Jim Morrison. It wasn't playful, it was dismissive. Back in Los Angeles, another musician watched Morrison and saw everything he warned against. Despite his strange image, Frank Zappa was fiercely anti-drug. He believed substances didn't just damage bodies, they warped people into versions of themselves he didn't want to be around. To him, Morrison was the perfect example. Drugs weren't the only issue. As the Doors grew bigger, the marketing grew louder. Posters, merchandise, slogans, myth, Zappa found it all distasteful. To him, Morrison wasn't a poet or a prophet. He was a product being sold harder than the music itself. Then there were those who simply saw nothing original at all. Known for warmth and humility, Jerry Garcia didn't bother softening his opinion. He openly admitted he never liked the Doors. He felt the band stitched together bits from others and passed it off as something new. His criticism of Morrison cut even deeper. He saw the early version as a physical imitation of Mick Jagger, copying the movements, the swagger, the presence. When Morrison later tried to reinvent himself as a poet, Garcia rejected that too, dismissing the comparison to real literary figures as forced and undeserved. The darkest connection came through friendship. For a time, Morrison was close with Dennis Wilson, bonded through music and shared influence. Hovering over that relationship was Charles Manson, a figure who seemed to stain everything he touched. According to Manzarek, Morrison and Wilson once picked Manson up while he was hitchhiking, unaware of what he would become. After the murders, everything unraveled. Wilson spiraled into addiction. Morrison grew darker, described by bandmates as a mean drunk. Fear, anger, and paranoia poisoned what was left. One night in the late 1960s, Wilson caught Morrison heckling bands at the Whiskey A Go Go and attacked him. The friendship ended there, violently and without repair. By the end, it wasn't just fans watching Morrison burn brighter and darker at the same time. The entire scene was watching too, and many of them had already turned away. Morrison's wild relationships. Morrison was wanted everywhere he went, not just as a singer, but as a face, a presence, a secret. Photographers chased him. Fans leaned in. Lovers stayed too long. He was a confidant one moment and a disappearing act the next, moving easily between deep attachment and casual intimacy. To many who knew him closely, he wasn't one man at all, but two. People who spent time around him spoke about that split without hesitation. When sober, Jim Morrison could be calm, thoughtful, almost gentle. He read constantly. He listened. He could make you feel chosen. But once alcohol entered the room, something else surfaced. The warmth thinned out. The edge sharpened. What had been charm could turn erratic, even frightening without warning. One of the first people to know him before the myth fully formed was Mary Werbelow. They met as teenagers on a beach in Clearwater, Florida, long before fame found him. Years later, she recalled that Morrison told her his first 3 albums were about her. Words delivered casually, almost offhand, just before a photo shoot. She never followed the band closely and never attended a concert. By the time she ended the relationship in Los Angeles in 1965, Morrison was already drifting toward something else. Those close to him never forgot her place in his life. Ray Manzarek described her as Morrison's first love, someone who stayed buried deep in his emotional memory. He also noted that The End began as a short goodbye song written for her before it grew darker and stranger, reshaped by Morrison into something else entirely. But the relationship that defined his adult life belonged to Pamela Courson. What they shared was open, volatile, and intense, but it never really broke. Courson didn't see Morrison as a rock star. She saw him as a poet and pushed him to keep writing when he wanted to drift. She followed his career closely, attended his shows, and believed in his work even when he didn't. Those around them often described her as fierce beneath a fragile surface, someone who matched Morrison's chaos with her own strength. Manzarek once said she was his other half, the only person who truly balanced his strangeness. Even when both had relationships with others, their connection never fully loosened. It stayed in place, quiet but constant, until the end. After Morrison's death, that bond became tangled in legal reality. Courson was later buried under the name Pamela Susan Morrison, and a court ruled that what they shared qualified as a common-law marriage. Morrison's will named her as his sole heir. When she died in 1974, her parents pursued his estate, which eventually passed to his siblings years later. On paper, the story ended. Emotionally, it never did. Morrison dedicated his poetry books, The Lords and New Creatures, as well as the lost writings Wilderness, to Courson. Writers have long speculated that songs like Love Street, Orange County Suite, and Queen of the Highway traced her presence. The relationship was often described as tumultuous, but it never dissolved. It simply endured. Alongside that core relationship, Morrison moved freely through the world of fans and fellow artists, groupies, writers, photographers, musicians. Some encounters were brief, others lingered. Names surfaced again and again, stories overlapping, memories conflicting. The line between intimacy and excess blurred easily around him. One encounter, fueled by alcohol, ended badly and became part of his reputation. Janis Joplin reportedly struck Morrison with a bottle during a fight witnessed by others. After that night, she referred to him with open contempt whenever his name came up. During a 1969 appearance on The Dick Cavett Show, she turned a joke about lighting her cigarette into a pointed dismissal, letting the audience fill in the rest. Another complicated chapter came through writer Patricia Keneally, who described a brief but intense relationship with Morrison that included a neo-pagan hand-fasting ceremony in 1970. According to her account, the ceremony was symbolic rather than legal, and Morrison never treated it with lasting seriousness. When she later claimed to be pregnant, she recalled that he grew distant and cold. Their connection fractured completely during his indecency trial, when she arrived unexpectedly and found him overwhelmed, fearful, and emotionally closed off. Morrison left for Paris with Pamela soon after. He never returned to face the court. His death ended the trial, but not the questions. By the time he died, there were dozens of paternity claims circulating around his name. None were pursued against his estate. Still, the number alone tells its own story. For someone so obsessed with myth and legacy, Morrison's personal life was anything but clean. It was crowded, intense, unresolved, full of desire, contradiction, and damage. And once you sit with all of it, the legend starts to feel less romantic and more uneasy, like something unfinished that never found a quiet place to land. How did Jim Morrison die? Jim Morrison died at 27, and nothing about it has ever felt finished. The moment froze in time, but the answers never did. Every version of his final days opens another question, and every explanation seems to leave something important out. In March 1971, Morrison left America and moved to Paris with Pamela Courson. On the surface, it looked like escape. In reality, it was survival. He was burned out, drowning in alcohol, circling drugs he claimed to despise, and carrying a reputation that followed him everywhere. Paris wasn't a vacation. It was a last attempt to slow the spiral. Back home, his image was already damaged. After the Miami concert in 1969, where accounts of what happened never aligned, Morrison was convicted of indecent exposure and profanity. The sentence came down in 1970. Prison time. Even with the appeal pending, the damage stuck. His name had shifted from dangerous artist to public problem. Around that same stretch of time, the scene was already losing its icons. Jimi Hendrix died, then Janis Joplin followed. Morrison reportedly joked about it, telling friends they were drinking with number 3. At the time, it sounded like dark humor. In hindsight, it feels like something else. Paris slowed him down, at least outwardly. Long walks, movies, quiet meals, writing. He stepped away from the stage and let the noise fade. Courson, however, was still deep in heroin addiction. Morrison hovered somewhere between resistance and exposure. He said he hated the drug. Others weren't so sure. Then came July 3, 1971. In the early hours of that morning, Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of their Paris apartment. That's the official version. That's the one written down. But it's also the point where the story fractures. Courson said they had gone out the night before, watched a movie, ate Chinese food, and returned home. She said they used heroin together. She said Morrison later had trouble breathing. She said she left him in the bathtub and went back to sleep. When she woke up hours later, he was dead. She called Alain Ronay, frantic, saying Morrison wasn't breathing. When firefighters arrived, they found Morrison in the tub, blood around his nose and mouth, Courson crying over him. French authorities ruled it natural causes, a heart attack, possibly worsened by heavy drinking. No autopsy, no further investigation. He was buried quickly. That explanation didn't sit right with anyone who knew him. Friends questioned it, family questioned it, fans questioned it, and Courson's own account didn't help. Over time, her version of events kept changing. Sometimes Morrison had been using heroin regularly in Paris. Sometimes the night he died was his first time. Sometimes he took it by mistake, thinking it was cocaine. Other times, heroin wasn't involved at all. Each version contradicted the last. The mystery deepened when witnesses came forward years later with a different story. According to these accounts, Morrison didn't die in his apartment. He died in the bathroom of the Rock and Roll Circus nightclub in Paris. The claim was that Morrison went there to buy heroin for Corson. After the purchase, he disappeared into the restroom. He never came back out alive. In his book, The End, Jim Morrison, Sam Burnett wrote that he found Morrison slumped over a toilet. His head was down. His breathing was gone. Something was clearly wrong. A medic at the club allegedly confirmed that Morrison was dead. Panic followed. According to Burnett, 2 drug dealers moved Morrison's body from the club back to his apartment to avoid trouble and protect their supplier, Jean de Breteuil. De Breteuil was well-connected, wealthy, and supplying high-grade heroin sourced from Morocco. He was also having an affair with Corson, while she and Morrison were living together in Paris. The story goes that Morrison was placed in the bathtub in a last attempt to revive him. By the time authorities were involved, the scene was already set. Once again, the truth slipped out of reach. Morrison was 27 years old when he died. His funeral was quiet. Only 5 people attended. The ceremony lasted 8 minutes. He was buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery. News of his death wasn't released publicly until 6 days later, a move meant to keep the press away. Official statements stuck to natural causes. Nothing more. Almost no one believed it. Over time, his grave became a destination. Fans gathered. Anniversaries turned chaotic. One memorial even erupted into a riot. Paris embraced the myth with screenings, exhibits, and tributes. The mystery only added fuel. Years later, more voices surfaced. One of them was Marianne Faithfull, who was living with de Breteuil at the time. In a 2014 interview, she said she knew what happened. She said she felt trouble the moment de Breteuil went to see Morrison that night. She said the heroin was too strong. She said it killed him. An accident, but fatal. She also said something else. Everyone connected to Morrison's death was gone, except her. De Breteuil died shortly after. Corson died in 1974. The people who could confirm everything were no longer there to speak. After Morrison's death, the Doors carried on briefly without him, releasing 2 more albums before dissolving. His poetry resurfaced later. His journals followed decades after that, published by his sister, Anne Morrison Tuning, who said she wanted the world to see the full picture, not just the legend. Still, the ending remains open. Bathtub or nightclub, heart attack or overdose, accident or cover-up. Every version circles the same truth. Jim Morrison didn't just disappear. He left behind a silence that refuses to settle. And the longer you look at it, the less certain everything becomes. She truly despised Jim Morrison. Now we finally understand why. As 2 members of the infamous 27 Club, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison are constantly spoken about in the same breath. Their deaths, so close together and so young, turned them into parallel tragedies, frozen forever as symbols of 1960s excess and self-destruction. History keeps linking them like kindred spirits. But that story falls apart the moment you look closer. Because Janis Joplin didn't just dislike Jim Morrison, she truly despised him. If someone had gone back and told her how often her name would be attached to his, she would have bristled at the idea. To her, Morrison wasn't a fellow rebel or a tortured poet cut from the same cloth. He was a problem, and she made no effort to hide how she felt. Music history loves feuds. Some are grand and public, driven by money, power, or ego. Others are petty, fueled by sarcasm and long memories. And then there are the ones that get quietly pushed aside because they don't fit the legend. The hostility between Joplin and Morrison belongs to that last group. It wasn't playful, it wasn't competitive, it was personal. Ironically, it didn't start that way. One night in the late hazy years of the 1960s, producer Paul Rothchild hosted a party at his home in the hills of Los Angeles. At the time, Joplin and Morrison were counterculture royalty, the queen and king of chaos, so Rothchild invited them both. He thought the pairing made sense. Same fame, same scene, same restless energy. He even planned to introduce them, expecting sparks. At first, that's exactly what happened. There was a brief moment of mutual attraction. Joplin was intrigued by Morrison's confidence and dangerous charm. Morrison was energized by Joplin's raw power and fearless spirit. For a short while, it looked like they might actually click. Then the drinking escalated, and the illusion collapsed. As Morrison drank, the qualities that made him magnetic disappeared. According to Rothschild, he transformed quickly, turning crude, aggressive, and unbearable. The charm evaporated. What was left wasn't funny or misunderstood. It was ugly. Joplin saw it clearly and immediately wanted out. She asked Rothschild to take her home, but Morrison wasn't done. As Joplin sat in the car, ready to leave the party behind, Morrison reportedly leaned through the open window, grabbed her hair, and tried to pull her back toward him. No charm, no joke, just entitlement. That was the moment it snapped. Joplin grabbed a glass and smashed it over his head. It wasn't dramatic, it was instinct. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The second incident came later at the scene. A gritty New York club known for its late-night jam sessions. It was a place where musicians went to drink, experiment, and perform without pressure. One night in 1968, Jimi Hendrix was on stage. Joplin was nearby, and Morrison walked in. The mood shifted instantly. Once again, Morrison was drunk. Once again, he crossed a line. An audience member later recalled Morrison swaggering over to where Joplin was sitting and yanking her by the hair without warning, pulling her down toward the floor. There was no build-up, no provocation, just the same behavior repeated. Joplin reacted the only way she ever did when disrespected. Another bottle came down on his head. What Morrison never seemed to grasp was that the wildness he admired in Joplin wasn't chaos for show. It was strength. She didn't bend. She didn't tolerate nonsense. She didn't excuse bad behavior because someone was famous, talented, or charismatic. She demanded respect, and she was quick to shut down anyone who didn't offer it. From that point on, there was no ambiguity. People around Joplin remembered how her mood shifted instantly whenever Morrison's name came up. There was no nostalgia, no softening, just irritation and contempt. A publicist later recalled that if you mentioned Morrison, Joplin's response was always the same. She called him an asshole. She was done giving him chances. She had already seen enough. On paper, they looked like they should have aligned. Two rebels, two leaders, two artists who lived loudly and burned fast. But reality doesn't care about symmetry. Joplin didn't hate Morrison because of rivalry or ego. She hated him because she thought he was awful. And once you understand that, the story stops being romantic. It becomes clear. Their names may be linked by death and myth, but in life, they were never allies. They were a collision. And Janis Joplin never forgot it. What are your thoughts on the feud between Morrison and Janis Joplin? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.